Can you tell us about both sides of the Tejanos' involvement in the American Civil War?
Well, one of the things left out in that bio, if any of you know the two of us, one of the things that will be very apparent is we will not end up in fisticuffs because Dr. Thompson is technically my former professor. And that's been left out of the bio. So imagine, we've done this once, maybe twice before at various other speaking engagements, and put yourself in my position for a second. Imagine you're going to sit alongside your former college professor, your graduate advisor. So put yourself in my shoes for just a bit. And going back to that question with that established, the contributions of both sides, Confederate and the Union perspectives on Mexican Texans, it seems like we're never going to get a very thorough answer, because unlike Billy Yank or Johnny Reb, who left letters behind, who left documentation, who wrote extensively into their later years, we're never going to get a very definite, precise answer to any of the questions that we may have. But nevertheless, we can get some broad perspective, some broad analysis of what the Tejanos did for the Confederate and the Union sides. And they worked both sides. Dr. Thompson has published extensively on both the Union and Confederate Tejanos, and the numbers are quite revealing, considering the percentage of estimated Mexican Texans right around 1860, which is about 25,000 of them in the Lone Star State. And out of those 25,000, about 5,000, both for the Union and the Confederate side, ended up fighting. So that in itself, you've heard, if you were part of the morning sessions, you've heard that the struggle for Texas becomes an integral part of the Union war effort and, of course, the Confederate war effort. We saw Dr. Frazier, highlight, the importance of the opening to the west, or the western flank, and at the same time, the Tejanos are going to play a role in all this, in fighting. They may not have the Gettysburgs, although there might be a Tejano in the eastern campaigns. They might not have the larger battles that are found in the East and dominates the Civil War literature, but they are going to find their place in the battles for the Lone Star State. Dr. Thompson.
Well, I think the war deeply divided the Tejano community, and I think it kind of depends on who you were and where you were. I think a lot of the counties on the border, especially the one that I'm familiar with, the Webb, which is Laredo, but also Zapata and to some extent Maverick and Star and Hidalgo and Cameron, there was a Tejano elite there, as there was in San Antonio. And I think those individuals, the Benavides family in Laredo, the Ituri family in San Antonio that I've studied, they had very, very close political connections to the establishment in Austin. Basilio Benavides from Laredo, for example, was one of two Tejanos who was serving in the legislature when the war erupted. Santos Benavides, that I'm working on a biography of, he became the only Tejano in the state legislature in 1878, which is an interesting story in itself. But when the Union Army came into the Lower Valley in late '63, they were led by a couple of guys, John L. Haynes, who had been a legislator from Rio Grande City, and of course E.J. Davis, who was well known in South Texas, having been the district attorney and the district judge there. E.J. Davis had kind of got his start with the Benavides family in Laredo. And they knew South Texas, and they began to recruit hundreds of Tejanos into the Union Army, even luring guys from Mexico with a big bonus of $200 to $300. So there was about 956 Tejanos and some people coming from Mexico, Mexicanos, who wound up in the Union Army, which is a really, really fascinating story in itself. Santos Benavides, I think, is a very, very fascinating story. And the more I learn about him, the more I really want to learn about him. He forms his own regiment, was told that he could be a general if he could recruit enough soldiers, and he couldn't quite do that. So although he's referred to himself after the war as general, he really never got beyond the rank of colonel. But he certainly is the highest ranking Tejano in the Confederate Army. And as far as I know, his regiment, I mean, they never knew a single defeat during the entire war. After the war's over, he just gets a polite note in the mail saying, you know, please sign your amnesty papers and forward them to Army headquarters in Brownsville, which he does. But we'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Alex is very good at the bigger, seeing the bigger picture and conceptualizing all this. I can kind of give you a lot of specifics if you want. Anybody would be happy. Go ahead.
Do you see Hispanics fighting east of Mississippi?
Yeah. Well, if you talk about just Hispanics, enlarge it from Tejanos to Hispanics, you've got a lot of Hispanics coming out of New Orleans that's in a regiment there. You've got a lot of Hispanics coming out of South Carolina that are Cuban. There's actually a general who's placed in charge of the defenses in Charleston by the name of Gonzalez. And I'm working on a book right now that I was telling Alex, it's one of these things that just seems to go on and on and on, like one of these automobiles that's out of control. But I thought that I would write a book on the New Mexico volunteers and militia in the war. They're about 95% Hispanic. And somehow this book just goes on and on and on and on. There's so much information out there about what happened in New Mexico. I'd always done the, kind of the Confederate side of the picture with Baylor and Sibley. So it's kind of interesting to jump over the fence there and look at this from the Union perspective. But I think there were close to about 5,400, maybe as many as 5,500 Hispanics from New Mexico who served in the Civil War. And you've got, for example, at the Battle of Alberta, you've got Tejanos fighting Nuevo Mexicanos, which is really, really interesting. So the war deeply divided the Tejano community.
We found one or two Mexican Texans in Hood's Texas Brigade, Hood's Tennessee campaign east of the Mississippi, making their way out to the battles for northern Georgia. So they've gone out in places that you wouldn't see them. In terms of larger regiments, they remain in the Lone Star State.
Baghdad, can you expound on that? Just where was it? What kind of trade was going on there?
Baghdad is just fascinating, and there is a new book in Spanish on Baghdad. Baghdad was known before the war as Boca del Rio, and it was just a little fishing village on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande, right where the river hits the Gulf. And of course we know how the Union slapped on the blockade, and as the war goes on, Lincoln's able to really tighten that blockade to where it becomes pretty risky to run that. And so the Texans in large numbers began, as you know, taking their cotton to Mexico. And some of that cotton was coming from as far away as Louisiana and even Arkansas. And most of it would come to the railhead there south and west of Houston, where they would put it on wagons. And then they would either take it to Eagle Pass, or they would take it to Laredo or Rio Grande City or Brownsville. Then they would put it on wagons and take it down the south bank of the river. A lot of the cotton in Brownsville would be put on steamers and taken downriver. So you got this huge community that just springs up there almost overnight that may have had as many as 15,000 people. And the descriptions of this is that it was a Babylon, it was a Baghdad. And they said that you could look out into the Gulf on any day there and see as many as 60 to 70 ships waiting to take on this Texas cotton. And in Brownsville are the manifests of a lot of those ships, and it's the most fascinating thing to see where those ships are coming from that took on that Texas cotton. And they're coming from, you would expect, Liverpool and Bremen, Havana. Of course, a lot of that's probably being taken on to Europe. But lo and behold, there's a lot of ships that are buying Texas cotton there from Boston, Providence, New York. And so I've always found that ironic that many uniform in blue that warmed many a Union soldier during the Civil War had something to do with Texas cotton. And so I guess money triumphs all, but those Northerners were buying that Texas cotton big time. But it's just It's just a community that just sprang up overnight. And unfortunately, we've looked and looked and looked. There are almost no photographs of Baghdad. Yet there are 2 or 3 well-known photographers in Brownsville and Matamoros that are taking a lot of really good photos there. But we can't find anything of Baghdad. There's a scene of a church and a sketch, but not much.
Any remnants of the town?
There's nothing there but just piles and piles and piles of pottery. But souvenir seekers have taken what was originally there. Now and then you'll find a brick. But it was washed away by a huge hurricane right after the war that just swept right over the island, maybe a Category 5 or something, and just swept right over Brownsville and Matamoros and even blew down brick buildings. So you can imagine the force of that.
Yes.
And so it was kind of like Indianola. It was never really rebuilt. But a fascinating place. People from all over the world were there trying to make a buck.
Yeah, the best descriptions I've heard of it, just to jump on what Dr. Thompson said, have been the equivalent of the transcontinental hell on wheels. Just chaos and opportunism, just all wrapped up into one.
Did Baghdad have another name prior to the Civil War?
Boca del Rio.
Boca del Rio?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Little fishing village.
Towards the French and the Mexican forces and the conflict along the border, is there much interaction, military interaction with the Union and Confederate forces? Do they cross back over?
Well, that's a really fascinating and complicated story, and maybe Alex can jump on this. In 1864, if you can imagine this, you've got 4 armies that are operating there in the lower Rio Grande Valley. You've got the liberals under Juarez who are trying to hold on to Matamoros because the only way Juarez can finance his army is through taxation on imports. So he's got to have Matamoros. So the French have landed Marines at Baghdad and they're pushing upriver. They're advancing from Monterrey. They're coming north from San Fernando. And so you've got the Juaristas fighting the French there. And of course, we say French. Many of those soldiers were Belgians and even guys from Austria. They really were not French, although they were part of the French Imperial Army. Well, in the meantime, Rip Ford, as you learned, had gone down there and he had kicked the Union Army out of Brownsville. They had come in there in late '63. Well, he drove them out, especially because they were shifting a lot of their men to Louisiana. But they were holding on to Brazos Santiago. Had some big guns there. There was no way the Confederates could really take Brazos Santiago. So they're skirmishing back and forth. So you've got an incident there in 1864 where when the French are pushing against the Juaristas, in particular my man Juan Cortina, rather than just give up, he takes several hundred of his men, as many as 600 to 700 men, takes them to the north bank of the river, and they're actually fighting with the Federals there, which causes the Confederates under Rip Ford, try to follow me, to get so upset that he's writing letters back and forth across the river and tells the French that he will go into Mexico and join them if necessary. So it becomes terribly complicated in that the Confederates clearly were on the side of the French and the Federals were clearly on the side of the Mexican liberals. And of course, when the war winds down, then the Union starts smuggling, shipping, getting arms into Juarez. And I think American arms helped make the difference in Mexico. But it's a really, really complicated story where you've got actually 4 armies that are operating there. And, to tell you a story which, is fascinating, and Alex knows I've written on this guy, Adrian J. Vidal. He was just a young kid in his late teens who happened to be the stepson of Mifflin Kennedy. So when the war breaks out, Kennedy, I think, helps to make him a captain in the Confederate Army. But the young kid didn't speak Spanish and was pretty wild anyway, so he deserts from the Confederate Army, goes across to Matamoros, and then when the Union Army comes into Brownsville, he crosses the river, joins the Union Army, and they made him a captain. Then he gets upset at the Union Army, I think largely under the influence of Juan Cortina, so he deserts from the Union Army, goes back into Mexico, joins the Juaristas. The French captured him up at Camargo and put him in front of a firing squad and shot him. So this guy, in a period of 4 years, had joined 3 armies and wound up being shot by a 4th. And so that kind of shows you, the confusion there on the river. But go ahead, Alex. I don't mean to hog the conversation.
That's quite all right. It's like a flashback all over again. Back to the lectures that captivated me during the Civil War. But in regards to Dr. Thompson, Vidal sort of exemplifies just the conundrum we have in trying to pinpoint Tejanos. We will likely never will, because there's always going to be this shifting sense of identity and loyalty that it's very difficult for many of us in the 21st century to fully grasp and understand. When I try to at least convey, this sense of lack of loyalty as it's perceived now in the modern era, I often point out that the general consensus in the United States as a whole, if you ask someone, how do you fill in the blank to this sentence, the United States blank, a great country, if you just want to fill that out, the consensus now is just writing the word is. The United States is a great country. But back at the midpoint of the 19th century, somebody could be a highly educated person could say the United States blank are a great country. It was just the sense of this era. And it applied also to Tejanos, which in the introductory remarks kind of emphasized this sense of who to side with, which Vidal, joining 3 armies, being shot like by a 4th, sort of exemplifies.
The Tejanos that fought for Texas, did their status or the opinion that Euro-Americans had for them, did that change from the time of Texas independence? Did their status in the eyes of Euro-Americans, did that change any?
By and large, I don't believe it really did at the midpoint of the 19th century. The general consensus all the way up, to kind of give you a sense, at the turn of the 20th century, the population, the male population, the Tejano population, over the age of 21, roughly 13% of them actually vote because they're unable to. There's been so many obstacles and limitations because they're just generally considered a lesser class. But the opinions of them, going specifically back to the Civil War, many Confederate Tejanos ended up deserting the Confederacy. I was talking about this over dinner last night with my department chair, Rick McCaslin, who you might have heard of this morning. We were talking about how the treatment they got from Confederate officers, the treatment that they received after a year or two, and Dr. Thompson edited a fine set of letters just last year emphasizing just how problematic this became, that many Tejanos were shocked, surprised, obviously upset by the fact that opinions didn't change about how they were regarded no better than a greaser.
There's a couple of letters in an archive in Monterrey, Mexico, by a officer by the name of Antonio Novato, who was the son of the famous Novato of Texas independence fame. And his letter is very revealing. He says, I just couldn't stand it in San Antonio anymore. The racism there was just really too much for me. So he actually fled down to Mexico and just set out the war there. And as I get into this, I'm finding that more and more Tejanos did that. They just didn't want to have much to do with this war. But then there's always Santos Benavides. He seems to kind of be the exception. And I originally started out thinking that I was going to write a dual biography of Santos Benavides and Juan Cortina. There had been biographies of Lee and Grant and Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. And I thought, well, I'm going to do this with Cortina and Benavides, because the two individuals came from very, very similar backgrounds. They were from well-to-do families, one in Laredo and one in Camargo. But by the end of the Civil War, Cortina comes to overshadow Benavides so much that I kind of gave up and wound up writing a biography of Cortina, and now I'm trying to do one on Benavides. But Benavides really remained loyal, and was. But I think at the beginning of the war, the politicians in Austin were really kind of uncertain as to what was going to happen, and so when he winds up fighting Cortina there in May of 1861, the war actually breaks out on the river there about the same time as Fort Sumter. But we shouldn't talk about that in relation to the Civil War, because it's really kind of an extension of the Cortina War. But Benavides decisively defeated Cortina at Carrizo, which is modern-day Zapata. And boy, the people in Austin are just all excited. I mean, the legislature passes joint resolutions praising him and his brothers, and Governor Clark sent him an engraved pistol, if you can imagine that. I don't think he did that for other officers. So they were really courting him. And his loyalty to the Confederacy was really significant during that war. He had been a friend of E.J. Davis before the war, and I think Davis tried to lure him in on the other side, but Benavides wasn't biting. He realized that his future was not with the Federal Army. But as Alex said, you know, there are mixed loyalties, and I'm beginning to see that more and more.
To jump back on that theme just a little bit, there's actually one memoir of a former Confederate Tejano, but he was actually born in New Mexico. He wrote a memoir in 1907. He was born in 1837. He wrote his memoir in 1907, so he was about 70, give or take. And he was actually a veteran of the United States 2nd Cavalry. Discharge papers came in 1860. Santiago Tafoya, even though his discharge papers said James. They just didn't want to deal with Santiago for a little bit. But he resigns from the United States Army, finds himself hard up for money in 1861, so he joins the Confederate Army. He winds up in San Antonio, and he's a little bit upset with how he's treated by his officers. So figuring that the writing's on the wall, that eventually something's going to happen to him and his fellow Tejanos, he and a few others just desert, bound for Mexico just to seek security. They ended up crossing right around Eagle Pass towards Piedras Negras, and eventually he joins the Union Army later on. But it's very revealing. I mean, the chapters are rather short, 4 or 5 pages each, but it's rather revealing to see his mindset, even though it's written many years after the fact. It's actually somebody talking about why he did what he did. He ends up being a Methodist minister around the hill country after the war. But he talks about what he did, and he's very clear that he and some of his fellow Tejanos felt that it was just a matter of time before they were going to be blamed for something and potentially shot or hanged. So they deserted. One of the problems that many Confederate officials found at the halfway point of the war, how to keep these men in uniform and loyal.
I thought that memoir was really interesting, and I really recommend it to you. Tafoya was born in that Santa Fe area and was really kind of brutalized by the family there and kind of looked upon as a peon. So he just followed a wagon train along the Santa Fe Trail. I mean, he's a really interesting individual. And I think Policarpo Rodriguez, if you know the name, I think he's the guy that kind of recruited Tafoya to become a good Methodist. But that's another story in itself.
Do we know the feelings of Confederate Tejanos regarding slavery? I mean, this is obviously kind of a race thing. Do we know, is there anything written out? Did like Benavides support slavery? Or?
You know, one of the things that I found, and it's only in like 3 or 4 lines, and I can't find much more, but Santos Benavides was actually acting there on the border as a slave catcher. And the Corpus Christi newspaper was praising him for going into Mexico and grabbing these slaves and returning them to their masters in Texas. I think he was getting like $300, which was a whopping lot of money back then. And I also, with the help of another researcher, found an interesting article where he also was apprehending Unionists who were fleeing the state and arresting them. And I don't know what was done with them. But one of the really great untold stories of Texas history that has more to do with the German Americans and the Tejanos is what's happening there in the hill country. And that story has not yet really been told. I mean, a lot of those people, especially the ones on the frontier in that Comfort, Fredericksburg area, they are to a large extent, and this can really touch off a fight and a hot debate, but they're really being brutalized. I saw an article a few weeks ago in the San Antonio paper where the sheriff of Kirk County was brought in chains. So, I mean, they actually went out there and arrested the sheriff. And so there were some Tejanos that were caught up in that. In that Nueces massacre, and it was a massacre, massacres when one side wipes out the other side like it's a little bighorn, they had a guy with them by the name of Diaz. And what he was doing with those Germans up there at Comfort, I've never really quite figured out whether he was a guide, but he was killed in that Nueces massacre. Getting a little bit off the subject, I'm sorry.
The subject that Dr. Thompson brings forth is pretty indicative of some of the struggles that we're just coming to grips with, is trying to figure out how they felt about slavery when the vast majority of them were largely illiterate. One of the things that I found particularly fascinating was how West Texans out there by El Paso County and right around Zapata County, how they dealt with the secession movement in Texas. And when you look at the 170 plus delegates, I mean, there's no Tejanos present, but the obstacles in terms of any Mexican Texan to really express their sentiment about Tejano, they were placed in late 1860, right before them. I mean, in Zapata, there were fines if you didn't vote, and there is no secret ballot per se. So everyone can see how you voted. And in the Mexican-American community, they're very class conscious. So you go with how your leaders go. You want that protection in terms of a job, security, economic security, for that matter. So in terms of South Texas, along the Rio Grande, there are punishments, the 50-cent fine if you don't vote. There are retributions, there's armed men just to observe how you vote. And out towards El Paso, there's documentation that the elites, that the Tejano elites have been promised jobs in exchange for making sure that they take the Tejano vote to move in regards to secession. So we're always going to be lacking that firm, concrete feelings and memoirs of how people felt about slavery.
Some data on that. In the slave census in 1860, there are 54 Spanish surnamed individuals in Texas who owned slaves. And most of those, or the majority, were in the San Antonio, Bexar County area. Some of them on the frontier. So I think that experience there for an African American slave may have been a little different than East Texas. They were more in a ranching environment. But if you look at the vote on secession, as Alex was saying, in Webb County, which is Laredo, there's not a single vote against secession. The county downriver is Zapata. They voted without a single person, overwhelmingly for secession. Starr County, same thing, true of Hidalgo and Brownsville. And you say, well, why would there be such a overwhelming vote for secession if this is tied up in the slavery question? Because there were no slaves in Webb County. There's no slaves in Zapata County. There's only 2 or 3 slaves like in Starr, Hidalgo, and Brownsville. And I looked at those, and they're mostly elderly women who I think are probably domestics in those wealthy homes of King and Kennedy and people like that. So why would those counties vote more for secession than even counties in East Texas? And I think Alex gives you the answer. I think the patron system is the answer. When the Benavides family in Laredo snapped their fingers, 100 people show up to vote. And you see this continuing into the 70s, 80s, 90s. And even when I came to Laredo many years ago, in the 1960s, there was a powerful political machine that ran that community. And people who worked for the city and the county and the schools, they were told how to vote because their jobs were dependent upon that political machine. And so those little county cliques, I think, existed then as they existed well into the 20th century. So I think that helps to explain that vote on secession, not slavery. Good questions, good questions.
Apart from the question of slavery, which I think is the central caused the Civil War. Is there any evidence that the Tejanos who served with the Confederacy were taken with the idea of states' rights, the Mexican federalist ideology of an earlier period, or to what extent do any of the Tejanos express ideology with regard either states' rights or central power of the government?
I believe there's different areas you can kind of view that. I'm not trying to be coy, but I believe that some Tejanos adopt a states' rights philosophy based on the fact that that's who they interact with. Borderlands historians, transnational historians are now coming across, what sets this sense of dual loyalties, and a lot of it has to do with relationships going from the turn of the 19th century all the way up to the Civil War, that the states' rights philosophy or this frontier philosophy begins to develop in Texas and you could say New Mexico as well. And what begins to happen is this is who the established relationships have been. When you talk about the Tejano elites, and we could think of three general areas, which is obviously the San Antonio area, Bear area, the Rio Grande Valley, including Laredo, which is technically not in the valley, but go all the way up, and a little segment out there in the western part of Texas, around El Paso. Tejanos not really found in strong numbers in Dallas or East Texas at this juncture. But the relationships that have been established, I mean, we're talking about Anglo elites and Tejano elites, whether it be San Antonio or the Rio Grande Valleys, this relationship based on accommodation. So who do they want to secure their relationships with, their economic future, if you will, whether it be the transportation hubs in El Paso or the agricultural/trade areas of the San Antonio and Rio Grande Valley. And a lot of it, I believe, is imparted. This is what you're supposed to believe. Now, a tweak on that is the border itself, which men like Benavides, which Dr. Thompson has been talking about, there is this philosophy that they adopt all throughout the 19th century, which is called libres fronterizos, free border people, which is a take on the states' rights philosophy. So they had always viewed themselves as individualistic. Northern Mexico, which is essentially southern Texas, had always viewed themselves as individuals, as somebody that's not going to play heed to this larger nation state, if you will. That's been one of the ways to sort of understand how much of an influence states' rights has, at least with the Tejano population. It's sort of trickled down, if you will.
Beyond the military, or fighting military, how significant were Tejanos to, say, the quartermasters, the cart trade coming up, or anything, they're not technically in the Army, but they're supporting either.
Yeah, they dominated that cotton trade. And there were fears as late as 1864 that they might try to start conscripting all those Teamsters. And some of the Confederate officers said, no, we need to be very careful about this because, we don't want to stop that flow of cotton into Mexico because that's where, the income is coming from to feed and arm the Army. So they certainly dominated that Teamster, all those Teamster routes as far as I know. I keep going back to the Benavides family, but building on what Alex said, to Santos Benavides in Laredo, it was just kind of a family war. I looked at some of the records, and he and his family, they had contracts to feed his army. His sister is renting buildings in Laredo to the Confederate Army. His brother not only runs the post office along with a brother-in-law by the name of Linedecker, but they also have the mail routes. So it's just a big economic enterprise there. And of course the flow of cotton kind of complicates that because you've got so much damn corruption in that flow of cotton that the Confederacy tries to control that through the Cotton Bureau, but even the Cotton Bureau becomes corrupt, and the guy in Laredo by the name of Thompson ran off with most of the funds, and Santos Benavides is chasing him all over South Texas trying to get the funds back from the cotton. But boy, the cotton was really, really important, and the Tejanos played a big role in that. And it's interesting that they never talked about the Civil War, they always talked about the cotton times. And to a lot of people, it was kind of an age of economic security and, in some instances, economic prosperity. But of course, that prosperity was not spread evenly because a lot of people got very rich and a lot of people didn't. But economics is a really important part of the war for the Tejanos and Tejanas.
To build up on that, the Tejanos become so important to trade, those cart drivers, so to speak. There had been a war, the 1857 Cart War, just a few years before the Civil War, as you well know. But during the Civil War itself, the Tejanos became so dominant in that capacity that they often received retribution from Anglo-Texans there, to the point where Confederate General Hamilton B pretty much has to order no attacks on Tejano cart drivers because he feared a repeat of what had happened just a few years earlier. And even though the aggressors were never prosecuted, and it always happens, there's an attack on a Tejano or a group of Tejanos, and eventually nothing ever happens, nothing ever materializes, but any further major attacks following those routes towards South Texas from Houston or San Antonio never really amount to much after that, after B sort of steps in, because that's how dominant or how vital the Tejanos were to the trade down there.
Earlier, someone asked how the Tejanos felt about slaves. How did they feel about the groups of Confederates who sought exile or went over into Mexico, ultimately going to Cuba and Brazil and Honduras? I mean, did they aid this? Did they encourage this? I mean, it is an untold story, but I'd love to know more about how they felt about this people who, obviously the Confederates who chose to leave the United States.
The flight after the war?
Yes.
How Tejanos felt about themselves or Anglo-Texans?
The Anglo-Texans, Anglo-Americans.
Okay. One of the things that I've often tried to impart whenever I talk about the border, and Dr. Thompson's been on the border a little bit longer than I have. He got there in the 60s, apparently.
Really?
But the border now is different, the border that the Tejanos themselves just saw it as going back and forth. And whenever I'm at a conference or a symposium, I often use my in-laws as examples. My in-laws are from Mexico, but they live on the north side of the Rio Grande. But yet they go back to Mexico for just about every single weekend, every single function that's done in Mexico. They have this dual nationalism, so to speak. And for Mexican Texans of the mid-19th century, and you could say all the way up to the early 1900s, this is the way it's supposed to be. You go where economic opportunity knocks. You go wherever your livelihood needs to be encouraged. And if you could transplant yourself from one nation state to another to make a life, to earn comfort, to entertain yourself, so be it. The border now as it exists, well, I guess that's subjective. The border now as it's supposed to exist as opposed to the way it was back in the mid-19th century. It's a completely different phenomenon, but there's this continual migration back and forth. Mexican workers come to Texas, then go back seasonally. So when they see others, it's the way it's supposed to be.
The Federals were seriously thinking about trying to arrest all those guys going into Mexico, and actually went as far as to contact Juan Cortina, who controlled a large part of the border at that time. And of course, Cortina's, well, we could talk about him for hours, but Cortina, not Cortina personally, but some of his men actually killed a Confederate general south of Matamoros in that flight into Mexico.
We're moving into the next time, so we're going to have to cut off questions, but I want to thank both of you for a very lively discussion.
Great questions. Thank you.
Wonderful.